The summer heat in London was unbearable, and crowds of tourists packed the streets around Buckingham Palace like sardines in a tin. Among them stood Jake Morrison, a 23-year-old college student from Texas adjusting his baseball cap and scrolling through his phone. He had come to London with his girlfriend Sarah and their friend Marcus, expecting nothing more than typical tourist photos and overpriced fish and chips. Jake had always been the type to push boundaries. Back home, he was known for his pranks and his inability to read social cues. His TikTok account boasted nearly 50,000 followers who loved watching him pull stunts in public places. Today felt like the perfect opportunity to create content that would go viral. The trio approached the iconic red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. These weren't just costume performers or actors hired for entertainment. The Queen's Guard, as they were properly known, were active-duty soldiers from elite regiments of the British Army. Each man had undergone rigorous training and earned the right to protect the royal residences. Their tall black bearskin hats, pristine red tunics, and stoic expressions had become symbols of British tradition spanning centuries. Sarah pulled out her camera, snapping photos from a respectful distance like most visitors. The guards remained perfectly still, their eyes focused straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the hundreds of people surrounding them. Their discipline was remarkable, having been trained to ignore distractions and maintain their positions no matter what happened around them. Marcus noticed a small sign posted nearby that clearly stated the rules for interacting with the guards. Visitors were expected to maintain a reasonable distance, avoid touching the guards or their equipment, and refrain from deliberately trying to make them break character. The sign also mentioned that these were working soldiers who would respond appropriately to any perceived threats. But Jake wasn't interested in following rules or reading signs. He saw an opportunity for content that would make him internet famous. The guard's stillness struck him as a challenge rather than a display of professional discipline. He began formulating a plan that would test just how far he could push these supposedly unflappable soldiers. The first guard Jake focused on was a young man who couldn't have been much older than Jake himself. Despite his youth, the soldier's posture was perfect, his grip on his rifle steady and sure. He had probably dreamed of this honor since childhood, working hard to earn a place in one of Britain's most prestigious military units. Jake started small, making faces at the guard from about 10 feet away. When that produced no reaction, he moved closer, waving his hands in the guard's peripheral vision. Sarah began to feel uncomfortable, tugging at Jake's sleeve and suggesting they move on to see the changing of the guard ceremony instead. The morning crowd was growing larger, and other tourists began to notice Jake's antics. Some laughed and pulled out their phones, encouraging him to continue. Others looked disapproving, particularly the British visitors who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. A few elderly locals shook their heads in disgust, muttering about disrespectful foreigners. Marcus tried to be the voice of reason, reminding Jake that they were guests in someone else's country and should show appropriate respect. But Jake was already too caught up in the attention he was receiving from onlookers and the potential for viral fame. He had crossed an invisible line in his mind, viewing the situation as entertainment rather than recognizing the serious nature of what he was doing. The guard remained perfectly still, but a careful observer might have noticed the slightest tension in his jaw. These soldiers were human beings, not statues, and they had feelings and limits just like anyone else. They were trained to endure harassment and maintain their composure, but that training had its boundaries. Jake pulled out his phone and began recording, narrating his actions for his future TikTok audience. He described his plan to see how far he could push the guards before they reacted, treating the whole situation like a game show challenge. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that he was harassing a working soldier who was simply trying to do his job with dignity and professionalism. As the morning progressed, Jake's behavior became increasingly bold. What had started as harmless face-making was evolving into something more serious. He began making jokes about the guard's appearance, commenting loudly about how funny the hat looked and questioning whether the rifle was even real. The atmosphere around the guard post began to shift. While some tourists continued to find Jake's behavior amusing, others were growing uncomfortable with the escalating situation. A few British visitors tried to intervene politely, suggesting that Jake show more respect. but he brushed off their concerns with typical American bravado. Sarah was becoming genuinely worried about where this was heading. She had seen Jake's pranks go too far before, usually ending with angry managers, security guards, or police officers. But this felt different. These weren't shopping mall security guards or restaurant managers they could charm their way past. These were professional soldiers representing one of the world's oldest monarchies. The guards' training was being put to the ultimate test. Every instinct probably told him to respond to Jake's increasing disrespect, but his discipline held firm. Years of military training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, teaching him to maintain his post regardless of provocation. Jake, however, interpreted the guards' continued stillness as weakness rather than strength. He began to believe that these soldiers were all for show, that they wouldn't or couldn't respond no matter what he did. This dangerous misconception would soon lead him down a path that would change his entire London vacation from a fun tourist adventure into a nightmare he would never forget. By noon, Jake's confidence had grown dangerous. What began as harmless tourist photos had transformed into a full-scale harassment campaign that was attracting unwanted attention from palace security. The crowd around him had swelled to nearly 100 people, many holding phones and recording what they sensed might become a viral moment for all the wrong reasons. Jake decided to escalate his tactics. He began making loud comments about American superiority, claiming that British soldiers were soft compared to their American counterparts. His voice carried across the courtyard, causing several British visitors to exchange worried glances. Sarah grabbed his arm again, pleading with him to stop. But Jake was riding high on adrenaline, and the cheers of a few misguided tourists who thought his behavior was entertaining. The guard Jake was targeting remained motionless, but something subtle had changed in his demeanor. While his face remained impassive, those trained to read body language might have noticed the almost imperceptible shift in his stance. His grip on his rifle had tightened slightly, and his breathing had become more controlled. These were not signs of weakness, but rather the quiet preparation of a professional soldier assessing a potential threat. Marcus made one final attempt to pull his friend away, pointing out that they still had the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey to visit. But Jake was completely absorbed in his performance, convinced that he was moments away from creating the content that would make him TikTok famous. He began talking directly to his phone camera, explaining to his future audience how easy it was to mess with the famous British guards. The situation took a turn when Jake decided to test the physical boundaries. He moved closer to the guard, positioning himself just inches away from the soldier's face. The guard's eyes remained focused straight ahead, but Jake could see his own reflection in the man's dark pupils. For a moment, Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something unsettling about staring into the eyes of someone who showed absolutely no reaction to provocation. But the uncertainty passed quickly, replaced by Jake's familiar cockiness. He began making exaggerated facial expressions, sticking out his tongue and making silly sounds. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed nervously while others began backing away, sensing that something was about to go very wrong. A plainclothes security officer had been monitoring the situation from a distance. These officers were specially trained to identify potential threats to the royal family and the guards themselves. Jake's behavior had crossed several red flags on their mental checklist: escalating aggression, boundary testing, and deliberate harassment of working soldiers. The security officer spoke quietly into his radio, alerting his colleagues about the developing situation. Within minutes, additional security personnel had positioned themselves strategically around the area. They remained inconspicuous, blending into the crowd of tourists, but they were ready to act if the situation deteriorated further. Jake, completely oblivious to the security presence closing in around him, decided to attempt his most audacious stunt yet. He had noticed that some tourists were taking photos while pretending to hug or pose with the guards from a distance. But Jake wanted to go further. He wanted actual physical contact that would make his video truly spectacular. He reached out slowly, planning to tap the guard on the shoulder or perhaps adjust the man's hat for a photo. This was the moment everything changed. The second Jake's finger made contact with the guard's red tunic, several things happened simultaneously. The guard's training kicked in with military precision. His entire body came alive in an instant. transforming from a statue-like figure into an active soldier responding to what he perceived as a potential assault. His rifle shifted position, and his voice boomed across the courtyard with an authority that made everyone within 50 yards freeze in place. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The command was delivered with such force and clarity that even Jake stumbled backward, his phone nearly slipping from his suddenly shaky hands. The voice carried the weight of centuries of military tradition and the full authority of the British Crown. The crowd's mood shifted instantly. The nervous laughter stopped, and the tourists who had been encouraging Jake's behavior suddenly found themselves stepping back and looking for exits. Parents grabbed their children, and several visitors began filming what they now realized was about to become a serious incident rather than harmless entertainment. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched her boyfriend's expression change from cocky confidence to genuine surprise. For the first time since they had arrived at the palace, Jake seemed to understand that he had made a serious mistake. But it was too late to simply walk away and pretend nothing had happened. The plainclothes security officers began moving through the crowd, no longer concerned with maintaining their cover. Their presence became obvious as they positioned themselves to contain the situation and protect both the guard and the tourists from any further escalation. Jake stood frozen, still holding his phone but no longer recording. The guard had returned to his previous position, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had felt like a game just moments before now felt deadly serious. The tourists around them were no longer laughing or cheering. Instead, they were watching with the kind of fascination people show when witnessing a car accident. Marcus grabbed Sarah's hand, and both of them began backing away from their friend, instinctively understanding that they needed to distance themselves from whatever was about to happen. Jake was on his own now, standing alone in a circle of tourists who were all focused on him with a mixture of anticipation and horror. The guard's warning had been clear and official. Jake had been given a chance to walk away with nothing more than wounded pride and a good story to tell back home. But as Sarah watched her boyfriend's face, she could see that he was struggling with a decision that would determine whether their London vacation ended with embarrassing memories, or something much worse. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see whether the American tourist would show the wisdom to retreat or the foolishness to push even further against forces he clearly didn't understand. The next few moments would determine whether Jake learned a valuable lesson about respect and boundaries, or became a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his life. Jake's pride proved to be stronger than his common sense. Instead of heeding the guard's warning and walking away, he made the worst possible decision. Standing there in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras, he chose to double down on his disrespectful behavior. The humiliation of being shouted at by the guard had triggered his defensive instincts, and rather than showing maturity, he decided to save face in the most foolish way imaginable. "Relax. Man, it's just a joke," Jake called out, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one. He raised his hands in mock surrender, but his body language suggested anything but compliance. Instead of backing away as instructed, he maintained his position just feet from the guard, still treating the entire situation as some kind of performance for his social media audience. The guard's response was immediate and professional. This time his voice carried even more authority, as he delivered a second warning that echoed off the palace walls. "I said stand back. Move away from the Queen's Guard immediately!" But Jake had convinced himself that this was all part of the show, that the guards were trained to shout but never actually do anything physical. This catastrophic misunderstanding of the situation was about to cost him dearly. He actually smiled at the guard as if they were sharing some kind of joke, completely missing the deadly serious nature of what was happening. The plainclothes security officers were now moving closer, speaking urgently into their radios. Their positioning was strategic, creating a perimeter that would allow them to intervene quickly if needed, while also giving the guard space to handle the situation according to his training and protocols. Sarah felt physically sick as she watched her boyfriend make one terrible decision after another. She could see the security officers closing in, could feel the tension in the air, and could read the expressions on the faces of the British tourists around them. Everyone seemed to understand the gravity of the situation except Jake himself. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media and news broadcasts around the world. Jake, in a moment of supreme stupidity, decided to reach out again. This time he moved toward the guard's rifle, apparently thinking he could pose with the weapon for a photo. He had no understanding that touching a soldier's weapon was considered an assault in virtually every military context on Earth. The guard's reaction was swift and decisive. Years of military training took over as he responded to what he correctly identified as a direct threat. In one fluid motion, he brought his rifle to bear and delivered a precise, measured response that neutralized the threat without causing serious injury. Jake found himself face down on the pavement with the full weight of British military authority pressing down on him. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some people screamed, others cheered, and many simply stood in shocked silence as they witnessed the consequences of pushing trained soldiers beyond their limits. Phones were raised everywhere as witnesses captured the moment when Jake's arrogance finally met its match. Within seconds, the plainclothes security officers were on the scene, their identification clearly visible as they took control of the situation. Additional uniformed officers appeared as if from nowhere, creating a secure perimeter around the incident. The crowd was pushed back to a safe distance, but not before hundreds of people had captured video footage of Jake's humiliating takedown. Sarah rushed forward, only to be gently but firmly stopped by a security officer who explained that she needed to stay back while they assessed the situation. She could see Jake on the ground, clearly shaken and possibly injured, with multiple officers standing over him. Her vacation had just transformed into a nightmare that would likely involve lawyers, embassy officials, and international media attention. Marcus stood frozen in disbelief, watching his friend being detained by British security forces. All around them, tourists were talking excitedly in multiple languages, many of them reviewing the footage they had just captured on their phones. Within minutes, the first videos would be uploaded to social media platforms, beginning Jake's unwanted journey to global internet infamy. The guard who had dealt with Jake returned to his position with professional composure, but the other tourists now gave him a much wider berth. His demonstration of controlled force had reminded everyone present that these were not actors or performers, but real soldiers with real authority and the training to back it up. Palace security began the process of clearing the immediate area, moving tourists back to create space for the formal proceedings that would follow. Jake would need medical attention to ensure he wasn't seriously injured, and then he would face questioning about his actions and motivations. The incident would require official reports, witness statements, and coordination with American embassy officials. As Jake was helped to his feet, his face showed a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and dawning realization of how badly he had miscalculated the situation. The confident young man who had started the day planning to create viral content now found himself at the center of an international incident that would follow him for the rest of his life. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before many tourists had shared their footage on social media platforms. Jake's face and actions were already spreading across the internet, accompanied by commentary ranging from mockery to outrage to amazement at his stupidity. His dream of internet fame was coming true, but in exactly the opposite way he had hoped. Sarah tried to get closer to her boyfriend, but the security cordon held firm. She would have to wait while officials determined the extent of Jake's injuries and the potential charges he might face. Their romantic London vacation had become a diplomatic incident that would require intervention from multiple government agencies and possibly result in criminal prosecution under British law. The aftermath of Jake's confrontation with the Royal Guard unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed emergency protocol. Within minutes of his takedown, paramedics arrived to assess his condition while Metropolitan Police officers began the formal process of documenting the incident. Jake lay on the ground, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by genuine fear as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Detective Inspector Margaret Walsh, a seasoned officer with 20 years of experience in dealing with tourist incidents, arrived on scene to take charge of the investigation. She had seen plenty of visitors make poor decisions around the palace, but Jake's behavior represented a particularly serious case of assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. The incident would require careful documentation and coordination with multiple agencies. Jake was conscious but clearly shaken as the paramedics checked him for injuries. His shoulder ached from where he had been restrained and his pride was completely shattered. The confident young man who had started the morning planning to become internet famous now found himself facing the possibility of criminal charges in a foreign, country with no understanding of British law or legal procedures, Sarah finally managed to convince the security officers to let her approach, but only after providing identification and confirming her relationship to Jake. When she reached him, she found a very different person than the cocky boyfriend who had ignored her warnings all morning. Jake's face was pale, his hands were shaking, and his voice was barely a whisper as he asked her to call his parents. The crowd of onlookers had been pushed back behind police barriers, but many continued filming and taking photos. Jake's humiliation was being broadcast live to the world through dozens of social media accounts, with more footage appearing online every minute. Comments ranged from sympathy for a young man who had made a mistake to harsh criticism of entitled American tourists who showed no respect for other cultures. Detective Inspector Walsh began conducting preliminary interviews with witnesses while Jake received medical attention. The testimonies were remarkably consistent. Jake had been harassing the guard for hours, had ignored multiple warnings, and had made physical contact with both the soldier and his weapon, despite clear instructions to stay back. The evidence was overwhelming and largely captured on video by the tourists themselves. Marcus found himself being questioned by police about his relationship to Jake and whether he had encouraged or participated in the harassment. He was honest about trying to convince his friend to stop, but he also had to admit that he hadn't done enough to physically prevent the situation from escalating. The officers were professional but thorough, making it clear that everyone present during the incident would need to provide detailed statements. Jake's phone, which had captured much of his own harassment of the guard, was seized as evidence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that his own recording would likely be used against him in any legal proceedings. His dream of viral fame was indeed coming true, but as a cautionary tale rather than the triumph he had imagined. The guard who had dealt with Jake remained at his post, having been commended by his superiors for his professional handling of a difficult situation. His measured response had neutralized a threat without causing serious injury, exactly as his training had taught him. Other tourists now gave him significantly more respect, understanding that his stillness represented discipline rather than weakness. American embassy officials were notified of the incident within hours, beginning a process that would involve diplomatic communications between the United States and United Kingdom. Jake's actions weren't just a personal mistake. They had created an international incident that would require careful handling to avoid straining relationships between allied nations. As evening approached, Jake found himself in a metropolitan police station, still wearing his tourist clothes but now facing the reality of British justice. The charges being considered included assault on a police officer, public disorder, and harassment. Each carried potential sentences that could range from fines to imprisonment, depending on the court's assessment of his actions and attitude. Sarah sat in the station's waiting area, frantically calling Jake's parents in Texas to explain what had happened. The conversation was difficult, as she had to admit that she had watched her boyfriend harass British soldiers for hours without successfully stopping him. Jake's parents were shocked and immediately began researching lawyers and embassy procedures for Americans arrested overseas. The incident had already made international news, with major outlets picking up the story of the American tourist who thought he could intimidate the Queen's Guard. News anchors and commentators used Jake's behavior as an example of everything wrong with entitled tourist behavior, and his name was trending on multiple social media platforms for all the wrong reasons. Jake's TikTok account, which had been his pride and joy, was now flooded with comments from around the world. Most were not supportive. Users mocked his stupidity, shared memes about his takedown, and used his incident as an example of why Americans had a poor reputation as tourists. His followers were leaving in droves, and his dreams of social media influence were crumbling along with everything else. Detective Inspector Walsh completed her initial investigation and prepared her recommendations for the Crown Prosecution Service. The evidence was clear and abundant. The witnesses were credible, and Jake's own footage provided perfect documentation of his escalating harassment. The case would proceed through the British legal system regardless of his nationality or any diplomatic pressure. As Jake spent his first night in British custody, he had plenty of time to reflect on the chain of decisions that had brought him to this point. Every warning he had ignored, every boundary he had crossed, and every moment he had chosen his ego over common sense had led inexorably to this humiliating and frightening conclusion. His story was already being shared around the world as a perfect example of what happens when tourists forget that they are guests in someone else's country. The royal guards, those seemingly motionless figures in their red coats and tall hats, had once again proven that their stillness masked a strength that foolish visitors underestimated at their own peril. Jake's arraignment took place 3 days after his arrest, in a London magistrate's court that had seen countless tourists face justice for their poor decisions over the decades. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and curious members of the public who had followed his story online. His case had become a symbol of tourist entitlement and cultural insensitivity that resonated far beyond British borders. Magistrate Elizabeth Thornton, a no-nonsense judge with 30 years of experience, presided over the proceedings. She had dealt with numerous cases involving disrespectful behavior toward the royal guards, but Jake's case stood out for its brazen nature and the extensive video evidence documenting his escalating harassment. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. Jake appeared in court wearing a borrowed suit, his earlier confidence completely gone. The reality of potentially facing months in a British prison had sobered him considerably. His court-appointed solicitor had explained that while first-time offenders sometimes received lenient sentences, his case had attracted significant public attention and demanded a response that would deter similar behavior from other tourists. Sarah sat in the public gallery, having spent the previous 3 days trying to understand British legal procedures and coordinate with Jake's parents back in Texas. Their vacation had become a nightmare of legal meetings, embassy consultations, and media attention. She had been forced to extend her stay indefinitely, watching her boyfriend face consequences that seemed to grow more serious by the day. The prosecution presented a compelling case that painted Jake as an entitled tourist who had systematically harassed a working soldier despite multiple warnings. Video evidence showed his behavior escalating over several hours, from harmless face-making to physical contact with both the guard and his weapon. Witness testimonies confirmed that Jake had ignored numerous requests to stop and had shown no respect for British customs or authority. Jake's solicitor attempted to present mitigating circumstances, arguing that his client was a young man who had made a serious error in judgment but posed no real threat to national security. The defense emphasized Jake's previously clean record, his apparent remorse, and his willingness to make amends for his actions. However, the extensive video evidence made it difficult to argue that his behavior was merely a harmless prank gone wrong. Magistrate Thornton was clearly unimpressed by the defense arguments. During the hearing, she noted that the Queen's Guard served not only as protectors of the royal family, but as symbols of British heritage and military tradition. Jake's behavior represented not just harassment of an individual soldier, but disrespect for centuries of national identity and sacrifice. The court heard testimony from the guard himself, a young corporal named James Mitchell, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his position at Buckingham Palace. His calm, professional demeanor in court contrasted sharply with Jake's nervous fidgeting. Corporal Mitchell explained that he had shown remarkable restraint in dealing with hours of harassment before finally responding to what he perceived as a direct physical threat. International media coverage of the trial was extensive, with news outlets from around the world sending reporters to cover the story. Jake's behavior had sparked discussions about tourist education, cultural sensitivity, and the responsibilities that come with traveling to foreign countries. Travel bloggers and cultural commentators used his case as an example of how not to behave when visiting historical sites. The American embassy had provided consular assistance but made it clear that they would not interfere with British justice. Embassy officials emphasized that American citizens abroad were subject to local laws and could not expect special treatment because of their nationality. This official position further isolated Jake and made it clear that he would face the full consequences of his actions. Jake's parents had flown to London to support their son, but they were struggling to understand how their seemingly harmless vacation had turned into an international incident. They hired a private solicitor to supplement Jake's court-appointed representation, but even experienced legal counsel couldn't change the fundamental facts of the case or the extensive evidence against him. Social media reaction to the trial was overwhelmingly negative toward Jake. Hashtags like Respect the Guards and Entitled Tourist trended worldwide, with users sharing their own stories of inappropriate tourist behavior and praising the professionalism of the British soldiers. Jake's social media accounts had been overwhelmed with criticism, forcing him to delete most of his online presence. The prosecution requested a sentence that would serve as a deterrent to other tourists who might consider similar behavior. They argued that lenient treatment would send the wrong message about the seriousness of harassing working soldiers and disrespecting national symbols. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to pursue the case aggressively, viewing it as an opportunity to establish clear boundaries for tourist behavior. Marcus, who had managed to avoid charges by cooperating with police and demonstrating that he had tried to stop Jake's behavior, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being a potential witness against his friend. His testimony could help establish the timeline of events and Jake's state of mind, but it would also confirm that Jake had received multiple warnings from his own companions before the incident escalated. As the hearing concluded, Magistrate Thornton announced that she would need time to consider the appropriate sentence given the serious nature of the charges and the international attention the case had received. Jake would remain in custody while awaiting sentencing, giving him more time to contemplate the full weight of his decisions and their consequences. The courtroom slowly emptied as journalists rushed to file their reports and observers discussed the likely outcome. Jake was led back to his cell, facing the possibility that his foolish pursuit of viral fame had cost him his freedom, his reputation, and potentially his future career prospects. The young man who had arrived in London seeking adventure and social media content was learning that some lessons come at a price far higher than anyone could have imagined. The sentencing hearing arrived 2 weeks later, and the courtroom atmosphere was notably more subdued than during the initial proceedings. Jake had spent those weeks in custody reflecting on his actions and their consequences, finally beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. His appearance had changed dramatically. The cocky young tourist had been replaced by a chastened individual who seemed to have aged years in just days. Magistrate Thornton entered the courtroom with a stack of documents that included character references, psychological evaluations, and extensive media coverage of the case. The international attention had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified as people around the world waited to see what consequences would follow Jake's behavior. The case had become a test of whether tourist privilege would protect someone from the full weight of justice. Before announcing the sentence, the magistrate delivered a lengthy statement that would be quoted in newspapers and legal journals for years to come. She explained that the Queen's Guard represented far more than ceremonial figures. They were active military personnel who deserved the same respect and protection afforded to any working soldier. Jake's behavior had crossed multiple lines, from harassment to assault, and had done so in full view of hundreds of witnesses and cameras. The magistrate noted that Jake's actions had not occurred in a moment of poor judgment but had escalated over several hours despite multiple warnings from authorities, companions, and the guard himself. This pattern demonstrated a willful disregard for British law, military protocol, and basic human decency. The extensive video evidence left no doubt about Jake's culpability or the deliberate nature of his actions. Jake was sentenced to 6 months in prison, with the possibility of early release after serving 4 months if he demonstrated good behavior and genuine remorse. Additionally, he would face a substantial fine equivalent to several $1,000s, and he would be banned from entering the United Kingdom for 5 years following his release. The sentence was designed to punish his actions while sending a clear message to other potential offenders. The courtroom erupted with activity as journalists scrambled to report the sentence and legal observers discussed its implications. Jake's parents, who had maintained hope for a suspended sentence or community service, were visibly devastated by the news. Sarah broke down in tears, realizing that their relationship might not survive the scandal and its aftermath. Jake's reaction to the sentence was a mixture of shock and acceptance. The weeks in custody had given him time to understand how dramatically he had underestimated the seriousness of his actions. When given the opportunity to address the court, he delivered what appeared to be a genuinely remorseful apology, acknowledging his disrespect for British culture and expressing regret for harassing Corporal Mitchell. The sentence made international headlines, with reactions varying dramatically based on cultural perspectives and attitudes toward tourist behavior. Many British commentators praised the magistrate for sending a strong message about respecting national institutions, while some American observers argued that the punishment was excessive for what they characterized as a prank gone wrong. Corporal Mitchell, whose professionalism throughout the incident had earned him commendations from his superiors, released a brief statement through military channels expressing his hope that the case would help other tourists understand the serious nature of the guard's duties. He emphasized that he bore no personal animosity toward Jake but supported the court's decision as necessary for maintaining respect for military service. The tourism industry used Jake's case as a teaching moment, incorporating his story into cultural sensitivity training and tourist orientation programs. Travel companies began including specific warnings about appropriate behavior around ceremonial guards and other cultural symbols. Jake had inadvertently become the poster child for tourist education programs worldwide. Jake's social media infamy continued to grow even after his sentencing. His case became a cautionary tale shared in travel blogs, cultural awareness programs, and discussions about American tourist behavior abroad. Memes featuring his takedown by the Royal Guard circulated for months, ensuring that his moment of poor judgment would follow him long after his prison sentence ended. The financial consequences extended far beyond the court-imposed fine. Jake's legal fees, extended accommodation costs for his family and girlfriend, and lost employment opportunities created a debt burden that would take years to resolve. His dreams of social media influence and easy internet fame had been replaced by the harsh reality of long-term consequences for short-term thinking. Sarah ultimately decided to end their relationship during his incarceration, unable to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the individual whose arrogance had created such chaos. She returned to Texas with a completely different perspective on travel, respect, and the importance of understanding cultural boundaries when visiting foreign countries. During his time in prison, Jake was required to attend cultural sensitivity courses and anger management sessions. These programs, designed to help him understand the impact of his actions, gradually opened his eyes to the broader implications of his behavior. He began to understand that his actions had reflected poorly not just on himself, but on American tourists in general. Jake's release from prison 4 months later attracted minimal media attention, as public interest had moved on to other stories. He returned to the United States a changed person, facing a difficult process of rebuilding his life and reputation. Employment opportunities were limited due to his criminal record and internet notoriety, forcing him to confront the long-term consequences of his moment of viral ambition. Years later, Jake would occasionally speak to travel groups and cultural organizations about his experience, using his story as a powerful example of how quickly tourist behavior can escalate into serious legal trouble. His case remained a frequently cited example in discussions about cultural respect, tourist responsibility, and the real-world consequences of social media culture meeting traditional institutions. The Royal Guards at Buckingham Palace continued their duties with the same professionalism they had always shown, but Jake's incident had become part of their informal training discussions. New guards were briefed on the case as an example of how situations could escalate and the importance of following proper protocols when dealing with disruptive tourists. The broader impact of Jake's story extended far beyond individual consequences. Tourism boards around the world began incorporating his case into their educational materials, using it to illustrate the importance of researching local customs and showing appropriate respect when visiting cultural and historical sites. Travel insurance companies started including behavioral clauses in their policies, making it clear that coverage could be voided for illegal or disrespectful actions. Marcus, who had witnessed the entire incident, became an advocate for responsible tourism in his own right. He frequently shared the story of his friend's downfall as a warning to other young travelers about the importance of speaking up when companions were making poor decisions. His experience watching Jake's behavior escalate had taught him valuable lessons about peer pressure and personal responsibility. The guard post at Buckingham Palace now featured more prominent signage about appropriate behavior and the serious nature of the soldiers' duties. While most tourists continued to show proper respect, Jake's case had demonstrated the need for clearer communication about boundaries and consequences. The new signs included specific warnings about the legal ramifications of harassing or touching the guards. Jake's story became required reading in several university travel abroad programs, particularly those sending students to countries with strong military or royal traditions. Academic advisors used his case to illustrate how cultural misunderstandings could quickly become legal problems, and how behaviors that might be acceptable in one country could be criminal in another. The incident also sparked discussions within military circles about the balance between maintaining ceremonial traditions and ensuring the safety and dignity of serving soldiers. While the guards' training and protocols were deemed appropriate, Jake's case highlighted the ongoing challenges of protecting ceremonial units from increasingly bold and social media-driven harassment. Ultimately, Jake Morrison's 15 minutes of infamy served as a powerful reminder that actions have consequences. Respect for local customs is not optional, and the pursuit of social media fame should never come at the expense of human decency. His story would continue to educate and warn future generations of travelers about the importance of humility, respect, and understanding when experiencing the rich traditions of other cultures. The Royal Guards, those silent sentinels in their red coats and towering hats, remained as they had for centuries, professional, disciplined, and ready to respond appropriately to any situation. Jake had learned the hard way that their stillness was not weakness, their silence was not passivity, and their tolerance had very real limits that foolish tourists challenged at their own peril.